Hello, welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Hendersonville. Thank you for joining us. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your journey in life, we welcome you. I am Ann Talley, your worship associate this week. I encourage you to check out our website at UUFHNC.org and learn more about us and our activities that relate to the world today. And please join us on Zoom Sunday morning at 11:30 for our Stones of Compassion and Beloved Conversations. We light this chalice, symbolic of the warmth of community and the brightness that love brings to the world, illuminating our search for justice and peace, light, that force that nurtures all living things, here in our midst in this flame, so tiny and so significant. Today's speaker is familiar to many of you in our congregation. John Owens and his wife Sarah Hassinger have been members of our fellowship since 2017 after moving here from Michigan. John worked for 20 years at the NBC television station in Detroit as a producer-editor, then another 15 years in corporate communications. In 2005, John was shot and nearly killed while entering the lobby of the TV station and suffers from a spinal cord injury as the result of his wounds. Since that time, John has spoken about his experience and recovery at churches throughout Michigan and North Carolina, including our fellowship. John is the group lead of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in Hendersonville and a member of the Everytown Survivor Fellowship, a nationwide community of survivors working together to end gun violence. Today, John will share his thoughts about the 30th anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a story he covered while working in television.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. Recently, during the COVID crisis, I've been helping out the church with some of their virtual worship services. And when I saw there was an opening in the schedule for the fall, I decided there was a topic I'd like to talk about, and really has received very little attention in the news. It's the 30th anniversary of the landmark legislation called the American with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Now, I find this legislation especially relevant right now because there is a disabled candidate running for the prized 11th District Congressional seat called Madison Cawthorn, a young man who was in a wheelchair due to an auto accident. Now, Madison doesn't shy away from his disability. As a matter of fact, it is on prominent display on his online videos and photos, and even during a national appearance in the Republican convention. And I think that's a good thing. 90 years ago, FDR hid his paralysis from the public for fear it would be perceived as a source of weakness, not fit for office. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. Now, history has been unkind to the disabled. Among the Greeks, the sick were considered to be inferior. Plato recommended that deformed offspring be put away in some mysterious unknown place. During the 16th century, Christians such as Luther and John Calvin indicated that the mentally retarded and other persons with disabilities were possessed by evil spirits. And in the 20th century, people with disabilities were often warehoused in institutions. I'm glad we have, for the most part, moved past these physical and mental barriers that used to divide the disabled from the greater community. Of course, this subject is personal for me. As many of you know, I was shot and nearly killed entering a television station in Detroit. The result? I have a spinal cord injury. I have partial paralysis of my legs. I'm lucky enough to be able to walk short distances, but use a wheelchair for everything else. Everything in my mind is measured by the moment I became disabled, and I'm certainly not alone. There are more than 61 million people in the U.S. who have some form of a disability. Mobility issues, blindness, hearing loss, dementia. That's 1 out of 4 adults, according to the CDC. If you live long enough, at some point, you will probably become disabled. How will you handle that life-altering moment? Well, for me, I had some pretty good role models. Let's start with the man I was named after, my grandfather, John Owens. My grandfather immigrated from Wales as a young child to work in the coal mines of eastern Ohio. Now, back in the early part of the 20th century, there were no child labor laws. If you could work, you worked. As a mule driver at the age of 15, a trap door at the entrance of the mine swung shut on his right leg. Later, the doctor would amputate his leg on the dining room table. Much later, when I knew my grandfather, he was very successful and still in mining as Secretary-Treasurer of the United Mine Workers, a union that was an early pioneer of providing health and retirement benefits for its workers. I remember as a kid watching in fascination as he put on his prosthetic leg, an untech version of the kind they have today. He didn't let his handicap stop him. He was full of energy and always wanted to prove to me he could do anything, whether playing baseball or going bowling. He was my first encounter with a physical disability. And if Athens, Ohio native Reverend Don Rollins is interested, my grandfather's archives are located in Ohio University. Now, one thing that didn't go in the library is this signed photograph from FDR from 1939. And it says, "To my good friend, John Owens, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt." That's something I will always treasure. Fast forward many years later, I'm working at the NBC television affiliate Detroit as a special projects producer and editor. Time period, the late 80s. I started to read a column called Disabled in Detroit in the Detroit Free Press. It was written by Jim Newbacher, a reporter immobilized by MS. Now, this groundbreaking column soon acquired a national reputation as a voice for those with disabilities. Jim spoke out about equal rights and opportunities for people in housing, childcare, access to transportation, and jobs. His motto, raise a little consciousness, raise a little hell. I thought we should do a similar feature at our television station, so I came up with a weekly feature called Abilities. And to anchor that segment, I reached out to a young disability activist and wheelchair athlete named Art Humphrey. Art was paralyzed by a spinal cord injury, an injury caused by his younger brother who accidentally shot him while playing around with a loaded gun. Now that's an all too familiar story. Myself and a camera crew followed Art and his team, the Detroit Sparks, to the National Wheelchair Basketball Championship in the early 90s. And here's that story.
We know exactly what we have to do. We came here for one purpose, and that purpose is to win a national championship. Our team is committed, and that's our goal.
It's giving me a positive outlook on life and letting me know that I can accomplish things that I set my mind to do. And not to be afraid, because a lot of people, when they get in a chair, they feel self-confidence, and out here, people just look at you as an athlete, not as a handicapped person.
You know, a lot of times when you say wheelchair basketball, they think it has something to do with Special Olympics or, you know, do you play in motorized wheelchairs and things like that. And they find out when they come to see us that, you know, this is a Class A sport.
Now let's meet the starting lineup. First for the Detroit Sparks. Number 42, Arthur Humphrey.
And we've got guys on our team who've played wheelchair ball for 26 years. It's great to be recognized as being one of the very, very best at what you do. The qualifying factor for wheelchair basketball is that you have to have a disability that affects either one or both of your lower extremities. And it could be either leg, and it could be paralysis, it could be amputation, it could be general weakness.
Allen, baby. My name is Joe Sudica. I'm a guard for the Sparks, and I probably average close to around 10 points a game. Paralyzed from the waist down, partial paralysis. And when you go there, there's 4 teams left. Win or lose, you have a good feeling of just being there right now with the 4. My mother and father are going to be going, my sister and brother are going to be going, my wife, and I have a new little 4-month-old baby, and she'll be going, so I'm excited.
You have to be in a wheelchair to appreciate their shots. You've got to be out there and try it. It's just as exciting as any other sport there is. This is their professional basketball.
In the first game, we played Casa Colina. Casa Colina demonstrated the heart, the desire, and the commitment of a champion. They showed real character. We had a chance to go up on them, and we made a couple runs, and they could have folded, but they didn't. They came back, and they beat us in the end. They deserved to win. Wheelchair ball builds friendships, and it's those friendships that are going to continue both on and off the court. They live in different parts of the country, but they've experienced many of the same things that we've experienced because of the disabilities that we have and they have, and they're not dissimilar. The opportunities to compete and to be at the very, very best is why we're all there.
Art and I worked together for 2 to 3 years, covering, among other things, the signing of the American Disabilities Act in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush, significantly improving access to public buildings, transportation, jobs, basically a civil rights bill for people with disabilities. So in many ways, I believe the ADA made it possible for people like Tammy Duckworth to become a United States Senator, an Iraq War veteran who lost both her legs in service to this country. And I believe it helped the recent candidacy of Madison Cawthorn, who doesn't have the barriers and ways that the candidate in a wheelchair would have found pre-ADA. So that's why I get a little annoyed when a candidate vilifies big government and regulations. Now, government, for the most part, didn't create air and water pollution or workplace hazards. But when big business didn't respond to these issues, government stepped in with environmental and workplace safety regulations for the betterment of public health and safety. The American with Disabilities Act is made up of thousands of regulations: access to buildings, curb cuts, handicapped bathrooms and parking spaces, elevators that can not only be used by people with mobility issues, but with braille instructions, and audio assist to indicate the floor. That list goes on and on. And yes, the bill is imperfect, but no piece of legislation is without faults. And the ADA costs millions of dollars to businesses in accommodations. Yet, it was the right thing to do. Here's a quote from President George H.W. Bush on the 19th anniversary of the ADA. "There is no place in our society for prejudice of any kind. And yet, it is not that long ago when Americans with disabilities were often not given equal rights and opportunities. Whether the cause was ignorance or indifference, it was not acceptable. We can all take pride in how much the ADA has accomplished, which is evident every time you attend a sporting event, ride a subway, or go to work. Yet there is always more to be done." Yes, there is more to be done. Anyone in a wheelchair knows that access is still a problem, but still tremendous progress has been made. And while it is no surprise that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a role in a Supreme Court decision that protected the rights of the disabled, Emily Ladue, a writer and disability activist, put it this way: "As a disabled woman, I celebrate many of her powerful opinions and dissents, especially the opinion Justice Ginsburg wrote in 1999, which declared that disabled people have the right under the American with Disabilities Act to receive state-funded supports and services in their communities rather than in a segregated institutional setting." This decision was just one of the ways that RBG truly did advocate for justice for all. Now, to get a better understanding of the disability rights movement, I highly recommend a documentary called Crip Camp, which can be found on Netflix. It is about a summer camp in New York in the early 70s, which was designed for teens with disabilities. And many of those young campers went on to turn themselves into activists for the disability rights movement and followed their fight for accessibility legislation, doing things like staging a crawl-in up the steps of the Capitol. Yes, Raise a Little Consciousness, Raise a Little Hell, a terrific documentary. Now, several years after passing the ADA, the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly passed a resolution stating that Unitarian Universalist Association undertakes an aggressive plan to address accessibility within the association for people with disabilities. In response, UUFH has initiated many accommodations throughout the years, including a ramp at the front entrance and inside at the altar. And of course, the biggest expense was the installation of the elevator to provide easy access for congregants with mobility issues to go between the sanctuary and the fellowship hall. I hope we get to use those accommodations soon. Again, I wanted to talk about this topic today as a reminder that for all our complaints about government bureaucracy and wastefulness, there are plenty of examples of legislation like the ADA that has improved the lives for all of us. It's an example of both political parties working together to solve a problem, something that is lacking in our divisive politics today. It's pretty easy to get down watching the daily barrage of negative political ads or where truth and science is constantly questioned, news is fake, a country that is deeply divided. So I want you to take some solace in the words of two disabled visionaries. Helen Keller said, "Optimism is the faith that leads to achievement. Nothing can be done without hope and confidence." Or Stevie Wonder puts it this way, "Just because a man lacks the use of his eyes doesn't mean he lacks vision." Or from my perspective, just because I can't walk up a trail doesn't mean I can't find a path forward. Take care, and thank you for joining me today.
Our closing reading comes from UU Minister Maureen Killoran. No matter how weak or how frightened we may feel, we each have gifts that can make a difference in the world. In this coming week, may you do at least one thing to support the broken, to do the work of justice and love. Be strong, be connected. Each day act, so you may be a little more whole.